All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks for joining us. My name's Dr. Matthew Iasiello. We're here to talk about a piece of work that we've been embarking on alongside the Department of Health Victoria and specifically the Wellbeing Promotion Office. And the title of the webinar today is We've asked 122 experts, what is mental wellbeing? And here's how it's shaping Australian mental health strategy. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the first peoples and traditional owners and custodians of the land and waterways on which we live. We honour and pay our respects to elders past and present. And I'm coming to you live from Adelaide, so acknowledgement of the Kaurna people. Monica, I believe, is in Melbourne, and Aaron is over in New Zealand. So let me, and if people want to let us know in the chat where you're coming from, please please do that. So we're really pleased to have alongside us for this webinar, Monica Kelly, who is the State Wellbeing Promotion Advisor and Executive Director of Wellbeing Promotion Office within the Department of Health, and Associate Professor Aaron Jarden from the University of Melbourne and the founding editor of the International Journal of Wellbeing. So welcome to our guests. Thank you. Everyone's on mute, so I'll keep. No worries. So in terms of a rough agenda, what we're hoping to do is really to cover off on, firstly, hearing from Monica about the new wellbeing strategy that's been launched in Victoria. I think it's an Australian first, and really quite a fortunate opportunity, I think, as Monica described it just offline before, that Victoria has had the opportunity to do this, and hopefully it's a useful example for other states in the country. Before we turn our attention to this piece of work that we've been involved in, which was a Delphi study around understanding or trying to reach academic consensus of what do we actually mean by mental well-being. And I'm sure a lot of people in the chat will agree that there's lots of confusion when we talk about these terms of mental well-being, positive mental health, wellness, these sorts of things. And then finally, we'll round that out with Aaron giving us a perspective of what this type of work means and where we can go forwards in terms of a continuing strong national conversation about mental well-being and well-being promotion in general. So there'll be time at the end for chat, for comments and questions. If people have questions along the way, Joep and Liv from our team will be there responding and also just keeping track of really good questions that we can keep for the end. So feel free to get going in the chat. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Monica. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Matt, and hello to everyone. And just to add to your acknowledgement, I am coming to you from Wurundjeri country and add my respects to the traditional owners here. I'm really delighted to join you today because I think this will just put into context how this work that Matt and team are going to talk about is helpful to us from a policy perspective. And to do that, I'm going to give you an overview of our Victoria's first wellbeing strategy. So next slide, just briefly, the Wellbeing Promotion Office, and shout out because there will be members of that in the call today. This is a first, and my position as the State Wellbeing Promotion Advisor is also a first for Victoria and in Australia. We've not had the capacity to do the policy work that supports the shift in focus of the mental health and wellbeing system to prevention and wellbeing promotion before. And we know that there's a rising prevalence of mental distress and we can't treat our way out of it. So in the same way that we in Victoria are, working to build infrastructure for our future, we also need to think about building the social infrastructure to support us into the future and support future generations. And you've got just a little bit of information on the slide about the Wellbeing Promotion Office and what we're here to do. As you will all know, there is, an established body of knowledge around wellbeing. It's recognised by the World Health Organization with the recent Geneva Charter for Wellbeing that was endorsed in 2021. And so we know that promoting wellbeing is a valuable objective in and of itself. It's been shown to improve quality of life and life expectancy. In fact, a high level of wellbeing not only reduces the risk of mental health conditions by up to 8 times, but it also improves recovery from diagnosed mental health conditions by up to 7 times. And in this way, this makes this strategy and this work important to all of us, not just individually, but the people that we love and care for and the people that we're here to serve. There are currently many ways to define and measure wellbeing across many disciplines. And I think that's where that lack of consistency affects our ability to measure wellbeing. And therefore, it has an impact on how we prioritise our policy and program efforts. And that's why the taxonomy of positive mental health is relevant to our work, because we need to move towards a consistent understanding of wellbeing across both the research and policy communities, and ideally measure consistently. And that will give us the chance to create stronger collective impact for improvement. Recognising this is not perfect, but we certainly need to make a start. So the slide you have in front of you is the one pager of the Wellbeing Strategy. And just to point out a couple of things, there is growing expectation that government does prioritise wellbeing. The Centre for Policy Development did some work that showed in the last few years it's increased from 70% to 80% of Australians saying that they want government to improve wellbeing. Now, if you stop and think about differences in our communities about what we can and can't agree on, that's a really high proportion of people who recognise that's what we want from government. So Victoria's first wellbeing strategy outlines our steps towards this. It recognises that wellbeing is influenced by social, economic and environmental conditions at all different levels. And the vision is that all people and communities have what they need to thrive both now and for future generations. We know that to achieve this, that we need a cultural shift as well as doing some things differently, particularly at a community and societal level. We all know we are social creatures, but we often think about wellbeing at an individual level rather than think about, if I need other people for my own good mental wellbeing, what is my reciprocal obligation to be able to support other people in their own wellbeing, and how do we think more as communities in the way that we do that? And I just want to highlight the needs in particular, but this slide outlines what people told us were the needs. We deliberately asked community first, and it was no surprise that that was strongly backed up by evidence, but people told us that they need to have their basic needs met before they can think about other aspects of wellbeing, and particularly at a time where we've had a cost of living crisis, that's not a surprise. And I also think it gives us a much more clear understanding of what we talk about when we talk about the social determinants of health. People also need a sense of worth and meaning in their life. They need to feel connected, and we avoided doing sort of here's the one framework for wellbeing, because it was really evident that it's different for everyone. And so I think these 5 needs really are experienced differently by other people. And in terms of connection, for some people that's really strongly other people. For some, that's less so other people, and it might be land, it might be country, it might be being in nature, it might be pets, or other ways of feeling connected to something. People also need to feel safe and respected for who they are, and we need the capability to navigate the ups and downs of life. And again, I found that personally a really interesting one, because much distress comes from interpersonal conflict at home and in workplaces. And when you step back and think about where is it that we learn the skills, there actually isn't anywhere that we deliberately teach people how to do that well. And we talk about the soft skills of being able to get along with other people, when in reality, they're some of the harder skills that we can learn. So talking about that cultural shift and needs, we translated those into aspirations and then into action. Going to the next slide, you'll see that we also recognise that this work, because making a cultural shift doesn't just is not something you can put in a program and it changes, it happens over time. So we also recognise that this is going to take some time as we shift towards that sense of more collective sense of wellbeing. And for me, that looks like where we get to a point where success doesn't mean being busy and it doesn't lead to burnout, where communities are restorative, both physically and socially, and we recognise and value the need to be respectful even when we disagree with other people, and perhaps especially when we disagree, because that is the only way that we learn and grow. We've also published an expected process of change, and the visual of that is on the slide. And we also have, associated with the 10-year strategy, a 2-year wellbeing action plan that will focus on the wellbeing promotion system that we will spend our time on in the next couple of years. So just a couple of things now that we've launched the strategy and are moving into implementation. Moving to the next slide. just to give you a flavour, we are looking to how do we embed wellbeing in decision making and thinking about what would be the appropriate investment agenda for this work, recognising that this is what people want government to do. We'll also do some work around producing evidence guides to support the use of research in practice. And we want to also strengthen data and monitoring of social and wellbeing outcomes. We're really lucky that we have the Victorian Population Health Survey in Victoria, and we've got some measures in Victoria of loneliness and social isolation as an example for the first time. But that's why the taxonomy work will also make an important contribution to our work, and in the future, hopefully allow us to be able to monitor that. Just finally, before we hear more from the team, I just want to remind you about the fact that we all need to play a role in this. As I've said, we're social creatures, and so this is relevant to all of us. And one thing I think is really important to talk about is on the next slide around leadership, because we all play a role as leaders in our communities, in our workplaces, and in other places we spend time with people, not about positional leadership, but about that personal leadership that we all have the ability to do. Some of you on the call will know me and know that I really value the work of Brené Brown, because I think she gives us a way to think about leadership, and she talks about how you do things is just as important as what you do. And I think we can't underestimate how important it is for all of us to show up as leaders. If we think back, the last election night federally, putting aside the politics, having a PM make comments about a culture of kindness, about respect and decency, is not something that we have had in this country before. And that sort of framing that we actually really need. And I think what that means for all of us in practice is that we have to be the people who are able to listen, that we need to create spaces of safety, and that we need to be the people that someone feels that they can talk to if they're in distress, and that we can be authentic and they know that they'll be safe, because that allows others to open up as they are. So for me, this is a practice for all of us to think about our own skills and how we improve on that over time, because with all of us on this call influencing and doing that in others, that's where we start to make significant change. So I would encourage you to have a think about that. And one thing that I will share is that in our work we've done in the kind of very pointy end of the mental health treatment system in relation to seclusion and restraint, the number one thing that actually reduces the level of seclusion and restraint is actually that when people come into the mental health service, that they, in a place of distress, that they are welcomed into a place of calm, of kindness and connection by clinicians and registrars. And that is the single biggest thing that makes the difference to the levels of seclusion and restraint within a mental health service. So I think we should have been on the next slide, but it's only a lovely reflection. There you go. And so I will leave you with that. I hope something to think about, and a good foundation for why we've worked with Be Well Co in terms of trying to get some better measures. And you've got some more information on the screen if you want to read more about the wellbeing strategy. So thanks, and back to you, Matt.
Thank you so much, Monica. That was really great, and it's reflected in the comments as I've been watching along. So you actually remind me with the slide of that it's everyone's responsibility. I think that there's been all this discussion in recently in the last probably actually since yesterday about the role of public health and certain decisions at certain universities, and a lot of that discussion, it seemed to actually mirror the issues that we face in wellbeing promotion, which is that there is no home for well-being. There is no one place. It is something that works across so many different sectors and disciplines. So, which is part of the confusion, I guess, too. But it is this risk that it kind of slips through the cracks a little bit too there. So thanks. And so join me, everyone, in congratulating, I think, the entire WPO team for the fantastic work. And I think many years behind the scenes that I think can feel, from the outside looking in, probably can feel a bit thankless. So well done to you all. It's a huge, huge moment. So there's a couple of claps I can see there. So moving on to the Delphi work. So absolutely, as you said, Monica, sort of in the name of consistency, we have this issue where, if people aren't familiar with Be Well Co, we're a social enterprise that sits within Camp Quality. So we're owned by the charity, and we have a sort of an academic arm to what we do and a sort of a translational arm to what we do. And it's a really big advantage for us because we sort of have our ear to the ground, I think, and we're hearing all this confusion when we talk about well-being. There are all these different models, there are different ways of talking about it, and really depending where you go, well-being can mean something quite different. And so as we see on the screen, I think we all agree that mental health is more than the absence of mental illness, but what is it? And all these different, this is really just a basic sketch. It's not absolute truth here, but the idea that these different disciplines or different settings will have quite different definitions of what we mean by well-being. We'll even call it different things. We'll call it mental health. We'll call it positive mental health, mental well-being, so on and so forth. We wanted to get to this place of a bit more consistency. And really, as Monica said, a lot of this work is about getting a lay of the land, basically, a bit of a landscape of what are we doing as academics, primarily to begin with, what's happening in the research world, how are we using language and concepts in mental well-being. So in terms of barriers to consistency, we know that, as I've said, different disciplines have different philosophical approaches. They are there for different reasons and different purposes. So the outcomes that they look for are different. There are different cultural contexts, knowing that things that are good for us, the idea of goodness is a value-laden concept. So different cultures will have different concepts of good. There's this idea of the jingle jangle problem where we'll use language differently, whether we're using the same word to mean two different things or we're using two different words to mean the same thing. And as a result, there are hundreds of measures of well-being. And I'm sure in the audience, people will all resonate with this frustration of wanting to know, what do I do about measuring the outcomes of the work that I do? Where on earth do I begin? There are literally hundreds of measures that I could be using and not much guidance in terms of which are more or less useful for which approach. And so our aim, as we'll go through, was really to work towards this idea of a taxonomy of the dimensions of mental well-being, and really trying to mirror some of the success from the behavior change world, where they had a similar problem of having many different models of behavior change. Mostly there's a degree of overlap, and Michi and co basically went through this very successful process of just clarifying what are the unique aspects of what we're talking about. So as we'll describe today, we've been through a series of 3 studies to get to the bottom of this, because there is no great place to start. So what we did first was a review of the measures of mental well-being, and we had quite a broad concept there where we looked at measures that included quality of life, resilience, or coping. Study 2 was taking the survey items or the questions from those surveys, sorting through them, figuring out, again, what was unique, what was similar, and testing that in an initial validation, which then gave us the combination of those 2 studies, the opportunity to put all of that information in front of a panel of experts and do what's called a Delphi study. And I'll go into more detail of all of these things. And the end result of those 3 studies is basically today's report, that people who will have a copy of the interim report, and we'll launch today online the full report, final report, on our website, which is what we'll talk through today. So to do this work, we've been really fortunate to work with a team of experts from around the country and around the world, including Aaron, who's with us today on the call. And we were really interested in, of course, having different perspectives, different disciplines, all with something to say for well-being from their sort of particular vantage point. So I'll quickly run through the studies, and Joep, I believe, he's copied the links of where you can find study 1 and study 2 in the chat for people that are interested. The first study was basically, like I said, what's called an umbrella review. So it was a review of reviews of measures of well-being. So what we found was that, we found 150 different measures of well-being. They said to be measuring basically 400 different concepts, but of course, once you start to synthesize them, you realize that, what I'm calling positive emotion, Aaron's calling happiness, Monica's calling positive affect. And so when we sort of did this thematic synthesis, we ended up with these 21 different dimensions. And that became the basis of, this emerging taxonomy. In study 2, we took more of a psychometric approach where we took all of the measures from those different items and sorted through them, chose the ones that looked to be most closely aligned to those various dimensions, did some psychometric testing, which I won't run through the detail too much of now. But I'll just point out that when we put these items in front of about 800 Australians and Americans, what we did see, which was really pleasing, is that these different dimensions that we're talking about, so things like happiness, optimism, connection, belonging, these kinds of ideas, they were starting to actually look quite separate statistically, which I know many will recognize is a bit of an issue when it comes to measuring well-being, that they kind of all correlate too much together. So this careful selection of the measures and the items, I think, was well validated. But just to point out, one of the problems that we face is that we actually removed, depending on the dimension, 29 to 96% of items because they are so similar. So it was this indication there's quite a lot of redundancy in this space, and it's something that we really need to do a bit more of. So, for example, different surveys that all asked about life satisfaction. Some asked, I am satisfied with my current life. I am satisfied with my life. I felt satisfied with my life. I am very satisfied with my life. And so I'm sure there might be some statistical purists who will tell us there's very big differences in the way these questions are asked. But I think for the average person, we're not seeing a massive difference, particularly in our reflection of our life satisfaction. What we got from that result, from that study, was a list of items that we had been able to identify the most useful items to sort of separate people at similar levels of that dimension. So, for example, here you see for the dimension of autonomy, the items highlighted there demonstrate the ones that were the most useful, basically, sort of like the most bang for buck that you would get out of measuring autonomy. And basically that gave us the pre-work to get into this Delphi study, which is where we were able to collaborate with the Department of Health Victoria. And so for people who are not familiar, Delphi study is about reaching academic consensus on a controversial idea. So something where there's a dispute in the literature. And so basically what you're asking people to do as experts, and we'll talk about the term expert can be a problematic term. We'll talk about that in a moment. But the idea here for us was to say, can we find experts who have a deep understanding of the academic literature of mental well-being from different perspectives to vote on whether these dimensions that we've identified are considered important to this concept of mental well-being. So what we did was we identified the top 150 authors from the most cited articles published in the last 10 years across 11 different disciplines. So again, like I said, there's this challenge that different disciplines all have a say and have some ownership over mental well-being. You can see them listed on the screen: economics, clinical psychology, medicine, nursing, philosophy, so on and so forth. And we also invited the authors from the World Happiness Report. And so for people who are unfamiliar with the World Happiness Report, that's an annual report that's published with leading academics contributing. So this gave us this balance between academics who have been well cited in the academic world, which means that they kind of have the trust of their peers. And the World Happiness Report, I guess, is for academics who are leading in their thinking, but may not necessarily have that academic traction, because we wanted to capture both of those things. What we did with this panel was invite them to 3 surveys, and you do this in an iterative process where you ask them, as you see on the screen, how important do you think that, for example, happiness is as a dimension of positive mental health? Is it essential? Is it important? Is it peripheral? Or is it irrelevant? And basically what happens is if 75% of the Delphi panel agree that it's essential or important, we consider it included in the taxonomy. If 75% agree that it's peripheral or irrelevant, then it's agreed to be excluded. And you have those the second and third rounds, if some of the dimensions don't reach consensus, so they don't get that 75% for or against, we give people another opportunity to vote. So in terms of the expert panel, in the end, we had 122 participants, 53% female, average age of 53 years old. They had an average citation count of about 12,000 citations. So in terms of the academic world, that makes them quite senior researchers to have attained that much acknowledgement from their peers in the sector. They came from 26 different countries, predominantly in the West. You can see where they came from in terms of disciplines, academic disciplines, how many years they'd been in the field. And we actually asked them to vote on what should we even call this thing? Because like I said, people, not only do we disagree on what's in it, we disagree on what to call it. And so you see the options that we put in front of them: positive mental health, well-being, mental well-being, other, positive functioning, mental health, and wellness. And positive mental health won the votes. And so that's what we have stuck with since then. And basically, these are the results of the first round of the dimension voting. So as you can see, the ones that are highlighted in green are the ones that reach that threshold of 75% agreement or consensus. And the one in red, being avoidant coping, was the one that was agreed to be rejected. And so avoidant coping was excluded, whereas the rest were sort of automatically put into the taxonomy. And it's worth mentioning that when we presented this to the Delphi panel, we also gave them a working definition and a couple of those representative items that we did from study 2. This is not scientific by any stretch of the imagination, but it's my little term of super consensus. It is worth noting that these 6 dimensions were actually agreed upon by 90% of the Delphi. So I think there's absolutely no contest on those ones. So that being meaning and purpose, life satisfaction, self-acceptance, connection, autonomy, and happiness. We then went into the second and third rounds of the study, which you see here. And so what we did also in round 1 was ask the Delphi participants, what else would you add to this list? What have we missed? And so that's where you see there's a couple that weren't included in round 1 that were included in round 2. And in particular, it was around the sense of community that there was a lot of discussion around. Actually, there's more to it than just calling it sense of community. So we sort of exploded that one out with a couple of other dimensions that were suggested by the Delphi panel. And you can see that a few were then accepted, highlighted in green. The next thing we did in round 3 was we then asked the panel, we gave them a definition of positive mental health that we'd worked on in a previous piece of work with Beyond Blue, which again came from sort of summarizing the key themes of dimensions that are out there in the published literature. And we gave them the opportunity to basically make suggestions to that definition. And so with their suggestions, this was the final definition. So I'll just read through it, but you can read along. Positive mental health is a personal and subjective experience where we are content with our lives, feel good, function well, and view ourselves favorably. Our level of positive mental health can vary over time and is influenced by the way we adapt to the problems and opportunities that we face. It's impacted by many factors such as our environment, life experiences, cultural background, biology, and behaviors. Many people have some level of positive mental health, and we can improve it by taking action using a variety of means, even when we experience a mental health condition. So taking these pieces, I see someone wants the slide up again. We'll make these available to you so you can go through it. And obviously this is all in the report, which we'll link to as well. Where we end up from here is, our sort of artistic, quote unquote, artistic rendition of this taxonomy. What we've done is kind of picking up on that network diagram that we got from study 1, picking up this idea that these dimensions are all connected to some degree. They don't all stand alone in one way. There's things that happen in the background that will influence many of these things, aspects of our lives that are within or not within our control. And we've categorized them into the 4 sort of topics that came through from the definition. So that top line of our definition spoke about being satisfied with your life, with, viewing yourself favorably, feeling like you function well, and feeling good. Which basically leads us with these 19 dimensions that were included in the version 1 of the taxonomy. And so from here, what's next? We really do see this as version 1 of the taxonomy. It's not set in stone. As I think we've been really transparent that this work has come directly from academia, which is not the only way of knowing, as we've pointed out, but it is a valuable place to start a conversation. So there's limitations in terms of, what do we define as expertise or particular perspectives of life. So trying to deepen this taxonomy in future versions to understand cross-cultural considerations, lay perspectives, lived experiences of mental health and of positive mental health. There's lots of work to be done in terms of creating structure for that taxonomy. There are lots of ways that we could organize the dimensions of the taxonomy. For us, we at the moment use those 4 themes, like I've mentioned, but there are lots of ways that others have talked about it. For example, things that are related to feeling, thinking, or doing. We want to continue to refine the measurement and make sure that that is working well for the Australian environment, and hopefully having others come along from other parts of the world and consider applications for policy and practice as well. And more ideas welcome basically for what we do with this. And really for people who have had experience with the Mishi taxonomy of behavior change, I know that's probably a little bit niche. I'm not sure if there's public health people, they'll be familiar with it. But that really has helped that sector be clear and move forward in a more cohesive way. And we're hoping that we can inspire something like that through collaboration. And so this is not a model of, it's not yet another model of well-being or anything like that. We hope that this is something that will continue to develop with collaboration. And the last slide I'll put up is just an acknowledgement of the list of contributors who formed the Delphi panel. These are people, it's not everyone. These are the people who were happy to be publicly acknowledged, and there are a few that remained private. But I'll leave them up. Hopefully it's not too small. You have a chance to read, and we'll now hear from Aaron, Associate Professor Aaron Jarden. And I think for you, Aaron, you've been involved in the project now for, I don't know how long it's been, a year at least, probably more. What do you think are the implications of this work? I know that, as I mentioned at the introduction, you're the founding editor of the International Journal of Wellbeing, as well as an associate professor at Uni Melbourne. So you've got your head around what's happening in the world and what does the field need. What are the implications of this work, and how can we continue a strong national conversation around a wellbeing promotion in Australia?
Thanks, Matt. Where to start? I mean, this is impressive work. I think there's a lot of research which goes on, which I could, to put it nicely, say is not that relevant and not that well done. And this is an example of extremely high quality, relevant research, which is extremely pertinent at this point in time, both from a academic perspective and a practice perspective. And just before I get into that, I also wanted to really shout out to Monica Kelly and her team at the Department of Victoria about their strategy. That, I mean, it looks world leading to me. It's very complex and well considered, and this research really fits into that. So when I think about the implications, when we think about how wellbeing science has developed, both from a research and academic perspective and for practitioners and policymakers, one of the big issues has been right at the core of this research. How do we define our terms? How do we all get on the same page? How should we define well-being? Are we meaning the same things? And if we're not, then that creates problems. It creates uncertainty for funders, for practitioners, even for academics and understanding the literature base. We have this huge literature base now of wellbeing science, where people are meaning different things by the term wellbeing, for example. So what this really does is help people get on the same page about the language that we're using. So that's one great benefit. The second great benefit is it really helps us understand that current literature base much better as well, with increased level of nuance. So it becomes more valuable to the research that we've already done as well. So that's another great benefit. But swinging back now to, how can we make this relevant for real world life? I think I'm picking up in society and what's happening globally at the moment, people are really starting to ask about, the world we want to live in and what that looks like. And well-being is at the core of that conversation. People are starting to think about this now. What does positive mental health look like? What does well-being look like? So this research provides them with the language and the definitions and the scaffold in which to think about that and position their conversation. So coming to your second part of it, of how do we have this conversation? The great Nick Marks from the UK used to say the best way to improve well-being is to have a conversation about it. And by that he meant, whether that's around a water cooler, or he was sort of getting to the point of it might not necessarily be doing a program, but what programs do is, or policies, is they help people have conversations about well-being. And here we've got a piece of research which gives a definition. It gives a nice, I don't want to call it a framework, a taxonomy of how these constructs might interrelate, and the ones that the academics from their research have identified as important. And I'm also pertinent to point out that you're really quite clear that this is non-prescriptive, and it's also not exhaustive. So that's where this conversation comes in. It helps people start by asking, what does a great life look like for me? What does a great day at work look like for me? What does well-being mean to me? How does all this fit? And we've got these ideas here, these 19 different dimensions for people to start thinking about, which they can expand upon, which is much easier than just starting from nothing. So, this is again, very impressive work from Be Well Co and the team there. So, a huge amount of credit. Very, very well done.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. Thank you. All right, so we have 20 minutes left. What we thought, in the vein of having a conversation around this topic, we are trying to be as absolutely transparent, basically, in the work that we're doing, and this won't work unless it has, engagement with community and with people in this sector. So obviously we can't do all that in 20 minutes, but this is an opportunity for some questions and answers. So if anyone has any questions, or if you'd like to raise a question that you might have raised throughout the session, whether it be directed at myself, Monica, or Aaron, please do so now. And Joep, if you're around and you saw some questions that you'd like to highlight, please let us know.
Yeah, I've covered off a couple of them in the chat, but there's one from Maya that I kind of parked, which I'd be keen to get your answers on, which is, what has surprised you about the outcomes of the research? So were there any surprises, or in general, where the taxonomy landed? And then there's another one that I'll come back to once you answer Maya's question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think from my perspective, the biggest surprise is that we did include, if you can see some of the dimensions that didn't make it, we included physical health, personal circumstances as options, and those were not included, or didn't reach consensus by the Delphi. And I think that that to me was probably quite surprising, that those were considered not to be dimensions of positive mental health. And I think I saw there was another comment, a question by, I think it was Chris. Why is it only a mental well-being? I think that is this panel basically separating, between what is our mental perception or our subjective experience compared to the aspects of life that drive that mental experience. And so I think it should be really important. It's an important reminder to consider that just because something isn't listed here doesn't mean that it's irrelevant to mental health, or that it's not a huge driver of mental well-being for individuals. I don't know, Aaron or Monica, if you have anything else to add on top of that.
You want to go first, Monica? Ladies first.
Thanks for that. I don't know. I mean, I think it's like we could. It's very complicated, I guess. At the end of the day, life is complicated, people are complicated, and trying to get things back to sort of definitions. There's many different ways you could think about it if you asked other questions. So I probably come back to, for me, I think this is a start that allows us to ask other questions. I think there's questions around, what does it mean in terms of community, etc. And if we asked in different ways, we can possibly expand that. But the importance of this work for me is that it gives that common definition for people who are involved in the work, or a greater sense of common definition. And for people who are involved in the work, we will be more likely measuring the same things that helps us get an understanding of it. And if I check back and reference to some of the work I talked about at the beginning and how we've defined it, noting that that was driven by community. And you can see already the consensus almost there with community as well, in terms of the things that people have talked about are valuable for their own well-being. So, but you will always uncover more and greater depth if you ask different questions, etc. I think that's a clumsy answer, but there you have it.
Yeah.
And for me, I see a lot in here. If you could just go back to the slide you had, Matt, there's a range of things in here which I think are really interesting. I noticed somebody in the chat asked what novelty was, and at the moment in wellbeing science is a new kind of model of psychological richness, which is really about leading a curious and novel life and getting out there and having diverse range of experiences. So whilst that might not be forefront of the current academic thinking and literature, it's going to be really interesting when we present this to more lay people and the average person about how they think about it. They might value that as a lot more, which is another one of the beauties of this project, that it's going to be an iterative process of checking to make it sure it's a really good fit for purpose taxonomy. So that's one novelty. I think it's an interesting result there. Another one that I really like is self-congruence. So the extent to which you're living your life in alignment with your values. So these are kind of things that aren't in any of the kind of wellbeing models or frameworks that the academics have proposed to date, which are really being highlighted basically through the interdisciplinary depth of this panel of experts, and really getting us to think about these are things that are important. Might not be important in your particular field, but they're important in our field. And then once everyone's starting to think about it and conceptualize it, they're going, well, yes, actually, maybe it is. So I see congruence as another one that's really important, and self-acceptance would probably be the third one as well. It's not talking about that often, but some of the great people in our field, the late Chris Peterson, for example, thought it was an oversight in the character strengths taxonomy that they created. So I see that as another one that is great to be there. So there's all sorts of interesting things in this taxonomy. I think, as Matt sort of highlighted, it's going to be interesting to see when it goes beyond the academics to putting it into practice, and where it fits with people and policies is going to be the next kind of where the rubber hits the road test.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. And probably just worth mentioning as well, like in the name of sort of communication and transparency, we actually as Be Well Co and as individuals have gotten onto Substack recently. So we'll host this on our Substack. It's free and all that, but the point is it's open to comments. We want to capture these different perspectives just because it is so valuable, and it doesn't feel like there's an immediately clear way forward in terms of where do we go? How do we find funding to work through some of these challenges that we're talking about? And so, if it has to be, from the ground up, then that's what we'll do. And so, yeah, more than happy to have this conversation continuing. I see that Kristen has their hand up. Kristen.
Hi, Matt. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Matt. It's Kristen from Headspace. I head up a large division of people putting prevention, health promotion things in schools and communities for the last 10, 15 years. And just really interested to hear Aaron and Monica's perspective on differentiating between individual wellness and the wellness of a whole community. Mm-hmm. Often when we're doing our natural disaster work or our suicide response and recovery post-vention work, it's one thing to measure the individual wellness and resilience, but then we're often working with leaders who are supporting and guiding thousands of people. What about the leadership of the larger group and the dynamic and the vibe of a whole community of wellness? Do you want to just comment on that?
I'd love to, Kristen. Thank you for the question. And, this is where there is more evolution of things. And I think one of the things that became obvious to us is that how do we shift towards a more of a sense of community? And, I mean, there are limitations to this, as Matt has talked about, and probably largely Western views around wellbeing. One of the things we really tried to highlight in the wellbeing strategy, with support from our partners in Ballot-Dern at VACCHO, is, there is a model of Aboriginal social and emotional wellbeing that actually captures more broad aspects of wellbeing. And I do want to just say, back to the sort of mental health question, and I'm sitting in a mental health division, we chose to use wellbeing because when we used anything that had mental in it, people went, it's mental illness. So we deliberately tried to move away from that, recognising that using that term's imperfect. So back to your question around how do we do this in schools, that's the bit that I think we've got some further work to understand, because our predominant cultural norm in Western society is to think about individuals, and it's not actually serving us. And like I said, I can't have good wellbeing without other people. And if you looked at many of these aspects, where do you get meaning and purpose from? It's usually through connection with other people, or by doing for or doing with. Like many of these things, you could actually, connection is largely about other people, not exclusively. So you could go through and see community aspects. And I think that's the bit that we have to get better about. And as you say, you have got your own, strong experience of the fact that these things don't occur in isolation. They occur collectively, and it's something we need to improve at. But starting the conversation, I think, helps that as well.
Very nice answer, Monica. I'd probably chip in too, Kirsten, and say, when I work in schools and ask kids from 5-year-olds to 18-year-olds, what does wellbeing mean to you? Every kid gives a different answer, but it's drastically different at those different age groups as well, what they focus on and think wellbeing is. But then it's different again when you ask the teachers. So what we sort of take out of that is wellbeing is a really personalized notion. It means different things to different people, which is, again, the great benefit of this taxonomy. You've got these 19 constructs where you can ask people, which of these is more central to your conceptualization of wellbeing. So if we take that kind of view and we think what we're actually doing is measuring people and just aggregating those results to think about there's a community or group level well-being, that's not really going to be capturing how that group's flourishing or functioning if we're using and measurement in that kind of way. And that's where this literature is at the moment. It's trying to really think about how do we measure a flourishing team in an organization, for example. No one's really nailed that just yet, but there's a lot of research going on about it at the moment. So the field itself is moving beyond the individual to the relational quite well at the moment, but then it's going to go beyond the relational to the collective and then to the bigger society. So it's just expanding outwards, but it's taking time, and it's getting better at involving other disciplines like sociology and public policy, other disciplines that have been really at the forefront of these larger systems for a long time. And the more it does that, the better the research will end up. So I just see this as a progression that's going to take some time to unfold from a research perspective nonetheless. But your question is really pertinent because it is a really hard one to tackle. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And Kristen, any follow-up?
Thank you for that. And, I literally just came out of a meeting, and I sit on the not-for-profit task force for the National Emergency Management Response to Natural Disasters. And of course, we're always talking about collective community wellbeing and social capital and all of those things. So it's really helpful. And then recently I was really lucky to have dinner with Dr. Dan Siegel, and we were talking about suicide and the increasing rate of suicide may be relevant to social determinants, cost for living, other things. And he was saying that in a lot of his work, he saw when people were feeling helpless and hopeless, that giving them a chance to give back and to feel helpful was the first lever and the most radical lever to reducing that helplessness and hopelessness. And I just thought, what an incredible thing to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just, maybe I haven't made it as clear as I could have, but that this is not the only answer. I think in my mind, this is a little bit about us in this sort of wellbeing promotion space, kind of cleaning up a bit of our backyard and acknowledging that this is not the only answer. It is at the moment individually focused. It is, has a Western bias. There's lots more work to do to expand past this, which I think both Monica and Aaron have alluded to really clearly. And I'm with you. As you say, we did a little bit of work that Joep, who's on the webinar, led with Disaster Relief Australia, which is about helping find purpose through volunteering for retired veterans in disaster relief, disaster recovery efforts. And I think it was quite amazing, if I can speak on your behalf, Joep, that sector is probably still quite dominated by a deficit focus. So even the integration of some indicators of meaning and purpose and autonomy and relationships was actually something that has almost never been measured in that space. So there's lots of work to be done, I think, across the board. We've still got about 8 more minutes. So any other questions from anybody? Just reading through the comments.
There's one that ended up in the Q&A, so you might have kind of missed it, and it was referred to throughout the chat around the impact of SES. And I mean, we spoke a bit about social determinants in general. But yeah, any comment around whether a socioeconomic lens got applied in the work and or how it influences it?
Yeah, I think that the work has come from what's included in the measures of the field, right? And so that does have, like I said before, that sort of the individual bias. And I think there's a pretty healthy academic discussion happening now. Not that it helps people so much in the real world, but where do we draw the line in terms of what is well-being and what are the most important drivers of well-being? And so hopefully by having this clearer lay of the land of what we mean by well-being, we can then start to determine how do these other layers of society influence these outcomes, basically. So it might be the case that things like life satisfaction and I'm just making something up, life satisfaction and happiness might be more significantly affected by personal circumstances and SES than other dimensions. And I think that level of granularity and nuance is the direction that we need to go as a field to understand what are the most effective sort of levers to be pulling. The only thing I would add to that is that including these dimensions as a taxonomy and focusing on these as outcomes doesn't hopefully negate the undeniable value of focusing on the other levels of the of society, basically. So those things like SES and the different determinants of health are undeniably valuable, whether they find themselves in a taxonomy like this or not.
Can I add something? Someone also asked about neurodivergent perspectives. I can't answer that for the research, but I can answer that for the development of our work in the wellbeing strategy. Our consultation involved extensive kind of conversations with people, including those with lived and living experience of mental distress, which included people, neurodivergent people as well, and communities. So I think, and that's where these are not the same things, but they're different. And I'm not going to say that it goes to all of those perspectives, but for me, that's where some of the perspectives of recognising that there isn't one framework and things like connection mean different things to different people. I think that's where that sort of showed up for us, because some people are like, no, I'm really happy not to spend lots of time with other people, but my connection to my room or my place or my space are really strong. So I'm not going to pretend that it's, a perfect piece of work, but it certainly, there has been some consideration in the strategy work. And then similarly in the strategy work around First Nations perspectives, yes, we consulted directly with Aboriginal communities. We had a separate and specific piece of work, and also, partnered with Bell at Jarden, who have written something about that in the strategy. So, I think we're getting better at that. And as I said, I actually think one of the things as Australians that we all would benefit from is actually leaning into more of that community wisdom that is there, represented in First Nations communities, because they've got that benefit of thousands of years that I think has led them to a more collective sense. And I feel like we're just playing a bit of catch up. But I can't talk to the research, so Matt and Aaron, you might want to add to that.
Yeah, Aaron, please.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting one. When you were talking about connection, I was looking at belonging on the screen, and that's obviously a really hot topic at the moment. But I'm also sort of finding or hearing people say well, belonging's great. It's actually a sense of mattering, which is more of a core than a sense of belonging. So some people may or may not necessarily want to belong to an organization or a club or a university or whatever, but everyone wants to feel like they matter. So they've got these, again, constructs which are really, really similar: connection, belonging, mattering, sort of overlapping with each other. But I was also just reflecting back on the previous question about SES and thinking that's also a great question, because if we look through different lenses of the academic literature, I mean, there's obviously still debates about the link between money and well-being, so to speak. But what it does show is that I think most people would roughly agree that we need a certain amount of financial resource to satisfy our needs. But beyond that, really, it's more about whether we're living within our means. That's what we found with a really big study in New Zealand. So that, I know someone posted about financial well-being before. It's hugely important. But what we found also was people that were earning hundreds of thousands of dollars a year and spending it had very low well-being. People that were earning very little but not spending at all had very high well-being. So I think that's we should be really cognizant of that as well, because when we look cross-culturally at countries like India that don't have a lot of financial resource, they're a lot happier than we are in Australia. People in the slums of Calcutta, it's really hard for us to wrap mind around it. They're earning $2 a day, but they're happier than us. And it's because they get to spend time with their family and they have a great sense of belonging. They have many of these constructs that we're looking at on the screen now. So I think we've still got a lot to learn about how we bring some of these learnings, like you say, Monica, from these other cultures into the West to really get benefit for everybody.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So I think we can wrap up. I think we've covered off most of those questions. I just want to thank everyone for their time, to our speakers and to our guests. I hope that you see this as useful and a productive step in the right direction, not a final answer. So thank you, everybody. I can hang around for the next 10 minutes or so if anyone had any questions. But other than that, thank you all very much.
Thanks all. See ya.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.